Okay, in this video we'll be looking at America's economic boom. We'll be looking at reasons why it takes place, for example looking at Republican policies of the 1920s, the new industries of the 1920s such as the car industry, new methods of production such as biomass production, the production line. We're looking at hire purchase and how that enables Americans to buy goods even if they don't have the money for them. And then finally we'll be looking at who doesn't benefit from the 1920s and the economic boom. The USA had grown in industrial strength up until the First World War, and by 1914 was leading the world in most areas. After the First World War, the USA could take full advantage of its industrial strength and therefore experienced a massive economic boom. This was an increase in the country's wealth and in living standards and in levels of production in industry, and also an increase in the ownership of consumer goods like fridges, radios, telephones and so on, especially the car. Effectively, America experienced a huge increase in their wealth and became filthy rich in the 1920s. So there are many reasons why there was an economic boom in America in the 1920s, and we'll go through them now. So the first reason we could talk about is the fact that the population of America had been growing. This led to increased demand for consumer goods. And as a result, the companies that made these goods profited. And therefore they can use that money to reinvest. The second reason is to do with this map here. Now America had huge amounts of raw materials right under its surface. So as a result, they didn't need to buy anything from abroad. So as a result, money just simply stayed in the USA. They were self-reliant. They didn't need any other country, and as a result, companies in America kept the money in the country. The next reason we could talk about is something called tariffs. Now, tariffs are basically taxes, and the one that we're concerned about is called the Fordney-Macumber Act of 1922. And what that meant was that foreign countries were taxed more, which made Americans buy from American companies instead. So it was cheaper to, let's say, buy a radio from America than it was from Britain because it would be cheaper. The British radio would be taxed more, the American radio wouldn't have as much tax on it, and therefore profits stayed in the USA. So money wasn't leaving. The next thing we can look at is the Republican policies, so the government of the 1920s. Now, there was a series of Republican policies that made America get wealthy in the 1920s. The first one we might want to talk about is the fact that they charged low taxes, which meant people had more money to spend. And if they have more money to spend, there are more profits for American companies. If there's more profits, there's more jobs because they might want to expand, and we also might get increased wages. So the fact that people aren't having to spend much on tax is a good thing in this case. The Republicans believed in a phrase called laissez-faire, and that basically means leave alone. They wanted to leave Americans alone to basically run their own lives, and it was this idea of also rugged individualism. They believed Americans should be rugged individuals, and this idea of get yourself wealthy by working hard. Another reason for the economic boom was because of new technology. So we had a boom in consumer goods. Now, more and more people were wanting these consumer goods because some of them were making their lives a lot easier and some were making their lives more enjoyable. So if we just take a look at this, you can see that radios, for example, between 1920 and 1929, the number of radios sold went from 60,000 to 10 million, number of telephones from 10 million to 20 million, and fridges. For every one in 1921, there were 167 fridges by 1929. And the reason for this was that they were cheaper to buy because of mass production, which we'll come to in a minute, but it meant that more were bought. And as a result, again, profits increased for those companies. And again, they can then maybe expand their companies, they can hire more workers, maybe wages go up as well. Then that brings us to potentially one of the main reasons for the economic boom, which is mass production. Now, this was invented by Henry Ford, this idea of the production line. Now, Henry Ford obviously owned the Ford Motor Company, and more products were made faster because they were being made on a production line. And we can show you an example here. So here we have a picture from the Ford plant where a Ford Model T is being made. Here there it is. And in the background, you can see all the workers are working on a separate part of the car. In the end, a Ford Model T was being made every 10 seconds. Now, if so many products are being made, it drives the price down, which more people can afford, and more are bought. And again, an increase in profits, which also therefore leads to increase in employment, which means more people have money, which means more people can in fact buy these consumer goods. We might also think about where the companies got all their money from to be able to expand and create these consumer goods. So in that regard, we need to talk about the stock market. Now, the stock market on Wall Street in New York was where people went to buy shares of companies in the hopes that they would make a profit. And there's more on this in the Wall Street crash video. But essentially, this led to companies increasing investment. So they had more people buying a share of their company, so they raised money from that, and that therefore meant they had more money to then expand and make the goods. They could pay their bills, they could hire workers, and so on, and again contributes to this boom. But there were more reasons for the boom. I've already mentioned the idea of the Ford plant and the car industry was massively important in the 1920s for the economic boom. The car industry employed thousands of workers, not just, for example, in making the cars on production lines, but also in what we call knock-on industries. So obviously, to make a car, you need materials. So these knock-on industries, for example, were steel, glass for the windows, rubber for the tyres. So these industries themselves boomed simply because more people wanted a car. And obviously with the production line, that drove prices down. So more and more people could afford them. Cars made it possible for people to also live in the suburbs and go on holiday. Obviously, if people are travelling more by car, you need more roads and infrastructure, like bridges, for example. So there's also a boom in these areas too. Another reason for the economic boom we can talk about is the fact that in the 1920s we had more advertising. So for example, on billboards, on radio, and also at the cinema, which was massively booming in the 1920s. So that obviously in turn made people see products such as the cars, the radios, the telephones, the fridges, and in turn people wanted these things. They felt as Americans they deserved them, so therefore they were willing to go out and buy them. Another reason for the boom we can talk about is the First World War. Now, the First World War had been very profitable for America. In the First World War, the US had sold weapons and materials and food to the Allies who were fighting the Germans, and as a result had made money from the First World War. Now that money they then used to reinvest in their own industry. So for example, part of that money may have gone into the car industries to help make those boom. Now this is a key phrase, this is one-way trade. The USA was not buying anything from the Allies. They weren't buying anything from Britain and from France. They were constantly just selling. So as a result, money was only coming into America, it wasn't leaving it. And like I said, they then reinvest that money into American industries after the war. And there's one final reason that we could talk about for why there is an economic boom in the 1920s, and that is hire purchase. Now, hire purchase what made it easier for people to buy goods, because they would buy now and they would pay later. Now, this helps more than anyone the poorer Americans, because they don't have to rely on having the money in their bank account. They can simply get a hire purchase loan. They can then buy things like a car, and then they pay that money back to the bank. But the immediate effect is that that industry, whatever it be it the car industry, for example, they get the money for that product there and then from the bank, from the loan. And people then simply have to pay back their loan to the bank. So the knock-on effect was there was an increase in sales from people who wouldn't necessarily be able to buy a product outright, which again means increased profits for the companies, means they can expand, it means that they can hire more workers, which in turn increases wages. And all these reasons then link together to create something called the cycle of prosperity. So, for example, when there is more demand, so let's say because there are new consumer goods that people want, or because the population is growing, then that leads to more being bought. Also, we could say it's to do with the fact that goods are cheaper due to mass production and due to higher purchase. So there's lots more opportunities for Americans in the 1920s to buy things. Now, if more are being bought, that does lead to higher profits. And if companies have higher profits, then they can expand, they can hire more workers. That in turn might increase your wages. It might even just give you a wage. If you are unemployed, here you are being offered a job because the company needs more workers, because they have more money, they want to develop, because they have this idea of being rugged individuals. They want to make as much money as possible, and so on and so forth. Increased wages in turn does lead to more demand. And this is also made more accessible because they are paying lower taxes, and they are being left alone by their government to spend their money as they see fit. So more demand, more bought, higher profits, more workers, increased wages links back into more demand. And that is the key ingredient of the 1920s. It is this idea of more demand. Okay, so this leads us to the darker side of the 1920s, and that is looking at who doesn't benefit from the economic boom. And you can remember these people by the term FLOP, because that stands for farming, low wage earners, older industries, and poor African Americans. So we'll start off by looking at farmers. Now, there are several reasons why farmers do not benefit in the 1920s. The first is because of overproduction. In World War I, farmers had been asked by the US government to create more food, so to grow more. However, when production had increased after the war, there wasn't the demand for it. So as a result, farmers were left with lots of crops that they couldn't sell. And if they've got more crops they can't sell, they have to lower prices. Once they lower prices, that means they aren't making as much profit. This is made worse by several other factors. So number one, machines like the combine harvester. That could do the job of 100 men, but only needed one to operate it. So as a result, there are more farm workers unemployed, And again, they were mainly African Americans. So that's more jobless, and therefore these people aren't doing well from it. We also have the fact that fridges have been invented and has as canned goods. And as a result, there is less demand for food because more people store them in fridges, or they've got canned goods which don't go off as quickly. So as a result, less demand means less prices are the prices are dropping, and you also get then less profit. So again, farmers suffering. Canada was selling wheat for a lot cheaper than America was, so therefore American farmers simply couldn't compete. So once again, the prices were going down, and as were the profits. You've also got the fact that Europe was too poor after World War I. So as a result, they're not buying America's overproduced crops. So this just kind of leads to that. That leads to overproduction. That's leading to overproduction. That's leading to overproduction. Everything leads to American farmers making too much, producing too much. The prices are going down, the lack of profit, and farmers are really suffering in the 1920s. The next group we're going to look at are the low wage earners. So the L in flop. Now, these were unskilled or unemployed, and they couldn't partake in the economic boom. Now, there were great inequalities of wealth in America. The top 5%, so the top 5% of wealthy people earned 33% of all American profits, whereas 42% lived in absolute poverty. So, for example, the farmers. So there was a great inequality in wealth. New technology and machinery was throwing more and more people out of work, and the number of unemployed stood at around 2 million throughout the 1920s. So they are unemployed. We also have to look at the older industries. So that is your O in flop. So these are people such as coal miners, so the coal industry. And that's because oil and gas were cheaper and more efficient than coal, and therefore that led to mine closures and falling wages for coal miners. You also had the textile and leather industry suffering because more and more people were turning to the flapper fashions, so less clothing was required, and more people wanted synthetic materials. They didn't want to be wearing leather or textiles like wool. They wanted new and more comfy man-made synthetic materials. So again, there is a decrease in profit for those industries, and again, there is less employment. Okay, and the final group in flop that we're going to look at is this idea of the poor African Americans. And there were about 1 million farm workers who lost their jobs as a result of farm closures or, for example, the combine harvester. Black workers in the towns in the north of America were the lowest paid, and the only work they often found were in low-paying jobs. In fact, in the Ford plant in Detroit, African Americans and white workers were paid the same, but white workers wouldn't even hang their coats on the same hooks as African Americans. So there was a lot of segregation for African Americans, and like I say, they only ended up normally in the lowest paid jobs, doing the lowest skilled jobs as well, because they couldn't get the education. You can see in these two images how the 1920s is nicely summed up. In the left-hand picture, you have a cartoon that shows how people in rural areas were suffering. And the cartoonist in this particular cartoon clearly sees that the industries in the cities were making lots of money, whereas rural farmers were really suffering. And you can see on the right the picture of the amount of Ford Model Ts that were being created in the cities, and the fact that so many people were being employed on the production lines. This image here, you can see how, again, the contrast in living standards in the 1920s. White people, especially in the cities, in the suburbs, were doing very well because they could seek employment, they could take part in things like entertainment, they could go to the cinema or go to sporting events and have a good time, whereas African Americans, for example, were segregated. They weren't able to get the same kind of jobs, the same kind of wages, so as a result suffered massively in this decade.